Okay then, good morning everyone. Welcome to the June 2021 board meeting held in public of the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, or the MHRA as we prefer to call it. My name is Stephen Lightfoot and I'm the chair of the board. My role today is to steer us through today's agenda. Now, for those of you who've not attended one of our board meetings before, I need to start by saying that this is a board meeting held in public and it is not a public meeting. But having said that, we are going to provide the opportunity for members of the public to ask questions at the end of the meeting. I think it's also important just to re-emphasise the fact that the board is responsible for the strategic leadership of the agency and is not responsible for individual regulatory decisions on specific products, because that's very ably done by the officials within the agency, with the support, of course, of our independent expert advisory committees. I also need to make you aware today that we'll be recording the meeting so that we can publish the video on our website to provide the opportunity for as many people as possible to see the work that we do. Now, I'm particularly delighted to say that we've got 26 members of the public who will be able to register to observe the meeting live today. And that's 12 people representing patients or patient groups. And we've got another 14 people from a wide range of stakeholders, from research, healthcare professionals, industry, media, and of course our own staff. So thank you for joining us all today, and you're very welcome. Now, today's agenda will be a little different from some of our normal meetings, as we've got some important governance items to complete before we get into some of the other topics. So we're going to start by reviewing and approving, hopefully, our financial accounts and annual report for the last financial year. And when we talk about years, we do mean the year of April 2020 through to March 2021. And then we'll obviously move on to our more usual items around healthcare access and patient safety in particular. We'll use the board pack for reference that has been provided. And I will certainly assume that all my board colleagues have read the papers so that we can spend most of our time today on discussion. And I'll use the page numbers in the board pack for reference to keep us all on track. Now, as the board works through our agenda, members of the audience can ask questions through the chat function on Zoom. And our Director of Communications, Rachel Bosworth, will then collate the questions so that we can actually answer them all, or as many of them as we possibly can, at the end of the meeting. So Rachel, just so everybody can see who you are, can you just give us a wave? Thank you, Rachel, that's great. I'd also like to take this opportunity just to introduce my other board colleagues and to everyone online. So first of all, Dr. June Rain, our Chief Executive, can you just give us a wave, June? Thank you. We've got Dr. Sam Atkinson, our Chief Quality and Access Officer. We've got John Fundry, our Chief Operating Officer. We've got John Quinn, our Chief Technology Officer. And Dr. Christian Schneider, our Chief Scientific and Innovation Officer. Thank you, Christian. We've also got our independent non-executive directors, and we're joined by Mandy Calvert. So give us a wave, Mandy, that's great. Professor Bruce Campbell. We've got Mercy Jessingham. We've got Professor David Webb.
Morning.
And we've got Michael Whitehouse. So we're also joined on screen today by Catherine Glover, who's the Deputy Director of Medicines Regulation and Prescribing at the Department of Health. So thank you for joining us, Catherine. And really pleased that we've also got Alison Strath, the Chief Pharmaceutical Officer from Scotland. So very welcome, warm welcome to you, Alison. We've then got Carly McGurry, our Director of Governance, and we've got Natalie Richards, who will be taking the minutes for us. So thank you for that. And then last but by no means least, we've got a number of people working in the background. So we've got Jude, Claudine, Sash and Patrick working behind the scenes to try and make sure this meeting runs smoothly. So thank you to all of their support as well. So from my point of view, that's the introductions. Can I just check with anybody if I've missed anything that's vitally important for me to inform everybody about? I'm seeing no waving hands, so therefore I'll take that as complete. So thank you very much for that. What I'd like to do now is just to move on to the second item on the agenda, which is around apologies. Now, we do have some apologies today from two of our non-executive directors, Dr. Barbara Bannister and Anthony Rogers, unfortunately, both unable to attend through other appointments this morning. We've also got apologies from Fleur Ruder from the Government Legal Department, and from Kathy Harrison from Northern Ireland, and Greg Chambers from Scotland. So I think everyone else is complete, so they will be the apologies. I also need to ask if there are any new declarations of interest that have not already been declared. Again, I'm seeing a stunned silence, and it's unusual for Bruce not to be making a declaration. So thank you for giving us a week off, Bruce. Much appreciated. Okay, that being the case, then let's move on to page 2 and then of the board pack, and move on to the minutes of the last meeting. First of all, can I just check, are there any questions of accuracy? Sam.
Thank you, Chairman. I believe I was actually at this meeting, but currently not listed on there as in attendance. So I think that just needs to be updated. Thank you.
Well, I'm very apologetic. That was not personal, Sam, in any way. I do apologise for that. That was clearly an oversight, but you definitely were at the meeting. Okay, Natalie, if we can just make that amendment to the minutes, that would be great. Were there any other comments of accuracy? Okay. That being the case, then can we approve these minutes as a true record of that meeting? Yep. Okay, so they're approved then, Natalie. Thank you very much. If we just move on to then the next page, or page 8, in fact, and just look quickly through the actions, just to make sure that we're on track with those. And I'll just focus on the actions that are due today, highlighted in red. So action number 15 is about reviewing the agency fee structure. John, is there anything that you could just update us on as far as agency fees are concerned?
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, happy to. So I think as the board's already aware, we formed a new agency fee strategy group with representation from right across the agency. It's met 3 or 4 times. We've deliberately defined the terms of reference to scope as quite widely. So in other words, not just covering fees for our statutory activities, but for example, covering our pricing for goods and services that we provide, for example, in NIBS. We've drawn heavily on the good work that the finance team have been doing over the last year, 18 months, in terms of looking at our costs and our income by fee type, and working through the various issues that's been identified. We're actively considering at the moment doing some market research just to see what others are doing in this space and what some of our customers' views are. We've also concluded that in order to get this done in time, we really need to put some dedicated resource on it. So we're in the process of bringing in, for a fixed term, likely to be 18 months, an individual with the relevant background in terms of steering legislation through, etc. And Catherine and the sponsor team are being very helpful in terms of helping us find someone. So we hope to bring someone in quite soon.
Yeah, I think actually that's the last point is particularly important. That this is not a quick exercise. This is not something we can do unilaterally. We clearly need the support of the Department of Health, and then depending on exactly what we're proposing, there may need to be legislative changes as well. So this is a 12 to 18 month project, I think it's fair to say, isn't it, John?
At the very least, I mean, it's 12 to 15 months from when you start to actually, any necessary tweaks to the legislation, consultation, etc. So from, initial diagnosis through to definition. So I think we're 12 to 15 months away, to be honest.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine. That's helpful. So thank you for that update. I think then item number 23, which is due today, is on the agenda. So I think we can leave any questions until that particular point. Item number 36 was just promoting the NICE accreditation of our drug safety updates. Rachel, have we done something about that? Can you just confirm?
Yes, that's in progress, Stephen, and we do regularly pick that up as part of the general promotion of drug safety update. Okay, that's great, thank you. Item number 37 was starting using the balanced scorecard. Obviously, you'll notice that it's not on the agenda today. John, can you just give us a quick update on the background to that?
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, the board has previously agreed a pro forma version of the balanced scorecard showing the measures for each aspect of the delivery plan. And we were going to do a full update quarterly with half the scorecard updated each month. We had the first run this month, and in all honesty, the quality really wasn't sufficient to share with the board, particularly the commentary that we were getting back from some areas of the business. So we've decided to regroup and perhaps change some of the people that are supporting us in that, and we'll come back with a better version in future.
Yeah. So I do think, just to emphasise, John, I think the narrative is particularly important, because I think we don't want the board having to try to work out what the data is telling us. I think we need the executive's perspective and interpretation of what the data is telling us, and also what actions are then going to be taken as a result of that. So the board can then challenge or support depending on the situation. I think the narrative is very important, is what I would say. But I think we can expect that at the next board meeting. Is that fair to say? The monthly one, that's the plan?
That's the plan, yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, thank you. And then the last item that's due today is number 40, and that's just updating the MHRA website on the dates for the isotretinoin expert working group. Rachel, can you just confirm that's been done?
Yes, that's been done, Stephen. The expert working group will be meeting with patients and other stakeholders on Friday the 16th of July, and I can confirm that everyone who responded to the consultation has been asked whether they would like to present at that meeting, and anyone who wants to come forward to potentially present to that meeting has until this Thursday to register. So that information's all on gov.uk, and it's also been sent directly to those who responded to the earlier consultation.
Great. Okay, well, thank you for Rachel. That's good, just to complete the loop on that particular one. Okay, that being the case, are there any other matters arising from previous meetings that have not been covered? No? Okay, well, thank you for that then. That being the case then, let's sort of finish on the actions of the last meeting and then move on to the first substantive item, which is around financial sustainability and what were the financial results of the MHRA in 2020-21. So, John, do you introduce this item, please?
Thanks, Stephen. Yes, it's worth saying that the financial statements that came around with this paper are version 1. We're currently at version 3 of the accounts, which is the version that we expect to publish in the near future. Probably the main number worth focusing on, paragraph 2.6 of the paper talks about our net deficit of £14.8 million. That's been driven by a couple of factors, really, which we've understood for quite some time, which is the loss of European income of around 17 million a year. During the transition period after leaving the EU, that was partially offset by 2 years or just under 2 years of transition funding from the Department of Health and Social Care, with the objective of enabling us to retain resources until we actually could assess the impact of EU exit and the new regulatory regime is clearer. That transitional funding ended in December, so that loss of income is now starting to be felt. And at an aggregate level, also, we've seen a general costs increase, primarily in staffing. Over the year, we've added around 100 extra staff, of which around 35 we describe as surge, coping with primarily actually the implications of EU exit, but also some COVID impact, with the balance being full-time resources. So those staff costs have also increased in terms of the numbers, but also salary increase. The cost of pensions has also increased, and we're seeing some increased systems cost in terms of depreciation and maintenance coming through. So I think those two factors reinforce the need to make the plan changes in how we operate. In terms of some of the changes that the Audit and Risk Committee are seeing in the accounts, there's been some technical changes in terms of the revaluation of plants and equipment. We put through some accrual adjustments, etc., the normal processes that happen as you go through the audit process. Probably, I think, the main item worth flagging before we're actually able to publish the accounts is we've provided for a 1.8 million VAT loss this year, which relates to Cprd, the Clinical Practice Research Data Link, which charges fees to a whole wide range of institutions for medical research data, and there was incorrect treatment of some VAT exemptions going back a number of years. So we've recovered an element of it, but we're writing off the balance, and we need Treasury approval to be able to make that adjustment to the accounts. So the Department of Health and Social Care approved it, and it's currently with Treasury. So before June is able to actually sign the accounts as accounting officer, and also the auditors proceed with their opinion, we'll need that approval. So that's the only substantive item, I think, preventing us from going ahead and laying the accounts. And it might be worth Michael coming in on that point.
Okay. Michael, obviously you reviewed this at the Audit and Risk Assurance Committee. Do you want to provide any further comments on that?
Yeah, Stephen. I mean, this is a very interesting year because it's the last year we are a trading fund, and from the 1st of April next year, we cease to be a trading fund, and we come for financial purposes within the full remit of the Department of Health, not for regulatory decisions, I would emphasise. Yes, at the Audit Committee yesterday, we focused on two things. Of course, we looked at the results from the external auditors, and I'll come on to that in a minute. What we also did was just look at the financial statements per se, what they were saying about the organisation and any adjustments that were made. John is right to refer to the increase in staffing costs, because one of the things we did focus on, we are very aware that over the last 12 months, the agency has made a mammoth contribution to the fight against COVID and the ability of the United Kingdom to get vaccines available very quickly. And we were just a little surprised that this was not reflected in an increase in the cost of the agency. We were given the appropriate assurances that the agency was aware of the resource implications of what they had done, and there had been various reviews undertaken at the moment. And I think John is right to say that the increase in staffing, which we focused on, was largely due to EU exit and some of the other factors that he mentioned. Having said that, we did look as well at the National Institute for Biological Standards. Again, if you look at the segmented reporting in the annual report, I think there's been an increase in expenditure of about 1 million, and there's been an adjustment in terms of there's a higher percentage of indirect costs compared to direct costs compared to the previous year. We explored that. We were given a reasonable explanation as to why that had happened. But the emphasis I want to give to the board is that we have looked at the accounts in detail and asked what we regard as the appropriate questions. I think if I go on now to external audit, the headline message that we received from the external auditors is if we can resolve the issue around VAT, the strong likelihood, and that's as best as auditors will give you at this point in time, is that they will recommend the Controller and Auditor General issues a clear audit opinion for the agency, and that includes the regularity component as well. Because there is this change in status, as a board, we are required for the remaining period that the agency continues to be a trading fund to assure us around going concern. Now, going concern has got two components to it. One is obviously financial sustainability for the next 12 months, where we have a reasonable level of resources to give that assurance. And beyond that, the other component of going concern is that we will, we are a going concern in terms of we can continue to provide the services that we are required to provide under legislation, which is the regulatory responsibilities that June and her colleagues exercise on behalf of the Secretary of State. Again, we were given assurances around that. And I think it's self-evident in terms of we have a legislative backing, we have resources, we have the skills. So that is not at risk in any way. And we're also able to point as a board that beyond the 31st of March of next year, we have as a board approved a series of actions that in the medium term are intended to get us into a financially sustainable position. So we took a paper yesterday and from my knowledge, the auditors are satisfied with that. So the way forward now is to resolve the issue with the Treasury around getting regulatory authority for the treatment of VAT. There are some minor adjustments that John and his colleagues are working through. With your agreement, Chair, I think the way forward now would be, if you are happy and the board colleagues are happy, to delegate responsibility to me as Chair of the Audit Committee, working with the Chief Finance Officer and Chief Operating Officer and the NAO to resolve these final outstanding issues and to put a note round the board at the point at which we can give agreement to June as accounting officer to sign the accounts. We talked about this. Obviously, if there was a fundamental change of any significant nature in terms of materiality or context, I would, of course, recommend that the board would meet again to look at these accounts in more detail. But I don't see anything fundamental at this point in time that would stop us in the next few days giving the backing for June to sign the accounts. If I may say one final thing, I'll open it up to questions. I think we ought to recognise as well, this has been a difficult year for most organisations in the public sector. I think the agency has done well to get where it is, and colleagues may be aware we are working to a shortened timescale, which creates difficulties. And the other point I'd say is that clearly, though, with anything like this, there are lessons to be learned. And I'm pleased to report that John Fundry, as Chief Operating Officer, will be working with external audit to actually learn lessons for next year. I think we have come on leaps and bounds over the last couple of years in terms of the way in which we resolve these accounting issues, but there's more to be done. I will finally say one thing. The Audit Committee congratulated and thanked Boriana, who is our Deputy Director of Finance, and colleagues will know that she has gone to a more senior position at NICE, but I just would like to go on to record as my formal thanks for the excellent work that she has done during her tenure at the MHRA, and she's still helping us up until the 30th of June to resolve these final issues. I'm very happy to take questions.
Okay, thank you, Michael. I think certainly it is right just to point out we'd typically be normally approving these accounts in July, and we've brought the timetable forward at a time of significant change and workload, and also with Boriana's departure as well. So I think all credit to Boriana and the finance team for the work that they've done on this. So I suppose what we've heard there is if you like, the technical commentary from the two accountants on the board. But June, is there anything you want to add just from a lay perspective when it comes to financial accounts? Because at one level, it is quite surprising that we've not actually spent more money on managing the COVID response.
You're quite correct. And we have looked hard at how we capture that expenditure. In passing, though, the fact that we were in lockdown and moved to home working meant a certain degree of efficiency on some of our external committee time commitments. Yep. And in fact, thanks to Boriana for some of the modelling work she's done, she showed that we were really much more efficient during that time. So in terms of doing better on demonstrating the costs, we have learned. But overall, I think as Chair of the Audit and Risk Committee, Michael Whitehouse has said, there are enough factors to take into account that I'm clear that with John Fundry and Boriana's work, these accounts can be signed off, subject to the VAT matter that's being resolved with Treasury.
Okay, that's right. We'll come back to Michael's proposal right at the very end, but let's take some other questions. So, Bruce, I think your hand was up first.
Just a question about what Michael said about COVID, because I didn't quite understand where he was going. You've asked about COVID in a different context, but Michael pointed out the agency has done a huge amount in terms of supporting the UK's response to COVID in terms of vaccinations and everything. And I just got the sense from him that there was a sense that we had not been sufficiently rewarded financially for doing so. Is that right, Michael? I sort of got a sense that you were questioning the agency's income over its huge contribution to COVID.
No, my issue, Bruce, is this. The financial statements are there. If the lay reader was reading these financial statements, given the amount of activity that the agency has done in the last 12 months, I would expect its expenditure to have gone up because of the sheer level of activity that we have delivered on COVID. And at the same time, as far as I can see, there has been no significant reduction in the other activities that the agency would normally do. We have seen an increase in staffing costs. And the challenge that the Audit Committee put to John Fundry was this increase in staffing costs a reflection of the additional work that we did on COVID? And if that was the case, we should make more of this in the commentary that we provide in the annual report, because I think that's what the lay reader would like to see. I think we were a little surprised to find out that the increase in staffing had arisen for other reasons, legitimate reasons. And the argument that the Chief Executive has just given is that there have been a number of efficiencies that have come into play over this last 12 months that have meant that the agency has delivered all that it had to deliver on COVID, but within its existing cost envelope. So on that basis, I think they're to be congratulated. It was just an area that I think we felt we had to probe.
Okay, thank you. John, was there anything you wanted to add to that? Because otherwise we can move on to another question.
Probably some just quick context. So, I mean, there is an element of directly attributable cost to COVID when we did the analysis. It was around 900K, and a chunk of that is related to NIBS. I mean, in all honesty, I think, the reason it hasn't flowed through, I think, is because our existing staff have been working a lot harder, is the base honesty around vaccines, batch control, etc. And there's been a degree of displacement activity where other matters are not being addressed. So the organisation is working hard. It's probably not just flowing through into the numbers. Yeah. And for example, we had the offer of considerable funding, for example, for NIBS's batch release activities for vaccines, if required, from the Vaccines Task Force. To date, we haven't yet had to draw on them.
Okay, that's great. I think that's helpful context, John. Catherine, is this a related point that you wanted to ask?
Yes, I just wanted to add my congratulations to Michael that the agency has delivered to the extent it has on COVID, and that reflects the incredibly hard work that staff have put in to do that on top of the day job, while recognising there has been some displacement. My main point though was it was great to hear John's update in the actions about fees and work to rebase on that, because particularly given the change in accounting treatment for the coming year, getting the fees right and making sure they reflect costs in all aspects of the agency's business will be incredibly important going forward.
Yeah, I think that's vital. Looking forward for definite. Christian, was that a related point about the work at NIBS and COVID by any chance?
Yes, Stephen, thanks. Just very briefly to say that obviously these are all deep specialist tasks. So the agency, I don't think had much choice in many of the areas, especially assessment of vaccines and so on. Because if you hire someone, it takes months, if not years, until they get up to speed with what is required. So there was not much choice there, but I agree with you. The agency and its staff need to be congratulated for that.
Yeah, I think that point's now been very well made, actually. So I don't think we need to be suspicious about the the lack of COVID visibility in the accounts. It's actually been very good leadership. It's been incredibly hard work by staff. It's been a lot of actually prioritisation of workload, and so I think it's more about the way the agency's dealt with the situation as opposed to having to take on extra costs to do that. Mandy, have you got a different question by any chance?
Well, it's related. I think we also discussed yesterday, if you look at the very top level of accounts, it looks like costs have increased by 8% and income has reduced by about 8%. And we just said that in the annual report, I think it's really important that's explained. So part of that is it isn't COVID, which we thought was the obvious thing, but I think it still does warrant a good explanation to understand those differences. It might be EU exit and the additional things, but I think we need to capture that perhaps a little bit more clearly in the notes of the financial statements. And I would also agree with what Catherine was saying. We did briefly touch on some of the costs related to other services and the learning about really understanding how much those services cost, things like Ilac for the fee structure, because I think we are still under recovering at what it's really costing us, and that's making it difficult. We've made huge improvements, but I think there's still some way to go. Yeah,
okay, that's great, that's helpful. I had one other question from Anthony, who's not here, but Anthony, it's a question to John Fundry actually, wanted to ask where the remaining 12.5 million or 12.6 million of NIHR cash investments for CPRD are located in the financial statements, so she couldn't really figure out where they were held. And that's based back on our board seminar discussion back in April, where it identified that there was £12.6 million worth of NIHR investment available for development of CPRD services. So there's probably an accounting rationale behind that, John, but it would be helpful if you could maybe just answer
that. Certainly I can. In order to teach Anthony a lesson, I can certainly offer an extensive tutorial in accounting for CPRD, which is not straightforward actually.
Yeah, I'm sure.
So we tend to refer to a cash number. Actually, the original investment covers any deficits, purchase of assets, and movement in working capital. So the cash is the majority element of that. In terms of a like-for-like comparison, last year's 12.6 million, which Anthony is referring to, this year's comparative is 8.6. But actually, in the accounts, due to the way the cash, etc., is actually handled, it's harder to actually find. So we can certainly unpick that for it. I think the reality of the situation is, yes, we do have some cash on our balance sheet applying to that original investment in CPRD, but the unused element of that will go with the rest of our reserves when we lose our trading fund status at the end of March next year. So I think the key question when we're looking at CPRD and its investments are, does that investment make sense?
Yeah.
And then in the background, if we decide to proceed with it, the finance team will work out the accounting for it. So let's make the call first, rather than how much cash have we got to spend on a particular area.
No, I don't think that's where she's coming from particularly, but I get the fact it's complex. And also, if I'm correct, John, on page 91 of the draft annual report, it shows the MHRA 50% share of CPRD, which is a further complication because NIHR have got an equivalent 50% presumably on their balance sheet.
That's correct, yeah. And we're actually also discussing some of the disclosure treatment with the auditors at the moment. So those numbers may well get revised in the final version.
Yeah, okay. All right, thank you for that. Mercy, do you have a question?
Well, yes, as John's handing out tutorials, I've got one. I think it relates to what Mandy was saying, but I just want to know what other trading activities were, because we're obviously 8 million lower. So just clarity on that, I think.
So the major chunk of that will be in NIBs, the various standards, sales, etc. So what we have to do in the accounts is we separate out the regulatory element and then all the up. So for example, NIBs global standard sales is non-regulatory and falls under other trading activity. And there's a whole range of other services that the agency provide that are not statutory, but do complement its activities.
Okay, thank you.
That's great. Okay, I didn't expect such a detailed conversation on the annual accounts, but I think it's good that we do actually work our way around this. Now, earlier, Michael made a proposal, and I think actually, if I can just sum it up, that was that his proposal was that the board should approve in principle the accounts and then delegate authority to Michael as the head of the Audit and Risk Assurance Committee to clear the final wording around the going concern and the HM Treasury approval of the VAT issue is concerned, and then provide a written note to the board that that has been conducted and is not materially different to what we've seen today. So would the board be content with that approach? I'm seeing nodding. Okay, so on that basis then, Michael, let's approve the accounts in principle, and then you have the delegated authority as chair of ARAC to clear the final wording. But as we talked about yesterday, Michael, if anything substantial comes up, you should actually flag that, and if necessary, we'll need to hold another board meeting to approve the accounts before June can sign them on 30th of June.
Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Okay, thank you for that. There was another sort of related question on page 12 of the paper, because the first one was to approve the financial outturn. The second part of the question was, and the board is also asked to consider the financial performance of the agency and the implications for the current financial year, in particular the path towards achieving financial sustainability. So I suppose, Mandy or Michael, you've discussed financial scenarios at ARAC, I understand, and I think we can maybe take assurance from that at the next board meeting is what I was thinking, unless there's anything you particularly want to add right now.
No, other than, this is a board meeting in public. I think the only observation I'd make is I think the agency has clear actions in play to deal with financial sustainability. So I don't think we have an issue around that. It's quite a significant task that we have ahead of us. And that would be my main observation. And I think the board is very committed to monitoring the implementation of these changes. So I think we can take assurance from that, but we can talk about this in more detail at the next board meeting.
Okay, and Mandy, was there anything else you wanted to add from ARAC discussions?
No, I would agree with Michael. I think we've got plans in action, both with the transformation and changes, the looking at fees. We've got a good foundation now of understanding our cost base a lot better than we did probably 18 months ago. Now it's going to be the progress of those actions, which will be really important to monitor. And that was something internal audit highlighted, the importance of having responsibility, clear responsibilities, actions, and monitoring progress. So I think that's the key for us.
Yeah, so I think what I'm hearing is there's a programme of work to address the £14.8 million deficit that we've had in the last financial year. And that's going to eventually be a combination of cost savings, it's going to be improved efficiency, and it's going to be looking at the fee structure to make sure that fees reflect the costs of delivering the services. So it's going to be a three-pronged attack, as I understand it, and that's work that's very much in progress. So I think as far as I'm concerned, that's probably all we need to say on that. But I just wanted to reference it. It was written in the paper as the board was asked to consider that. But I don't think we need to consider that any further at this moment. But we'll come back to the ARAC assurance report at the next board, Michael, where you can maybe talk about the financial scenarios at that particular point. Okay. Related to the accounts, obviously, then is the draft text of the annual report. And so obviously that is still work in progress. And so we circulated that separately from the board pack. But I think, Rachel, is there anything you want to say by way of introduction to this? And then we can maybe take some comments.
Yes, thank you. So this is the, if you like, the other half of the annual report, the narrative section that gives an overview of the agency's work and events during the 2020-21 financial year. So the draft text is at a relatively final stage. It includes contributions from across the agency, from EXCO, from the Audit and Risk Assurance Committee. And so it's really to flag a final opportunity for the board to provide any comment or questions or additional things you'd like us to cover in advance of finalising the text and getting the annual report and accounts laid before Parliament by the 30th of June. As the chairman said, the draft text has been circulated separately, and if we could ask for any last comments by the end of the day tomorrow, that would help us to meet the timetable we're working to.
Yeah, so I think that's helpful, steer, Rachel, in terms of if we see any sort of small drafting issues, small typographical errors, for example, we don't need to waste the board time today discussing those particular items. So please let Rachel, email them to Rachel by the end of tomorrow will be the clear ask on that one. An important part of the annual report is also the governance statement. And Michael, again, I know at the Audit and Risk Assurance Committee, you've actually reviewed the governance statement. Was there anything else you wanted to make the board aware of as far as that's concerned?
No, it would just, if I could just prevail just to have 2 minutes, that the board it fully understands what the governance report is doing, the statement. So the governance statement is a really important document in sense of it conveys to our stakeholders broadly that we are a well-managed organisation and that we are using our resources effectively. It is a document that June as accounting officer signs and is broadly held accountable for. And it is the summation of a number of pieces of work. So we have the risk register, we have financial control, we have information assurance. All of these are really important to the success of the agency. And June gets independent assurance from internal audit, the government internal audit agency that does a series of reports throughout the year. And our conclusion yesterday at Ilac was all of those things have come together very well. There are no fundamental issues around compliance as to what should be in the governance report, and also in terms of what the information is telling us around the resilience and quality of the controls that exist. There's inevitability that one looks to the future, and there were 2 comments that I would make. External audit have looked at this and they can draw comparisons with other organisations. Their own main observation was we focus very much on the new governance that we put in place since the new calendar year following the governance review. They really want to make sure that we emphasise that prior to that, there were no fundamental governance weaknesses as such that would have put public money at risk. And I know John and his colleagues are looking at that. The second point I'd say is we took the opportunity to look at the governance statement and to say, what did it say about the organisation and what it continues to need to improve upon as we embed the new executive structure following the governance review. And I think Mandy referred to that. There are some issues around strengthening leadership, having good objectives, monitoring outcomes, and ensuring that those systems are operating effectively. As an audit committee, what we have asked the chief executive and the new director of governance is to come back to the committee, probably December, January, with a revised, what I would call assurance framework, so that as all the changes that are now going through are embedded within the organisation, by this time next year, we can be even more assured by the governance statement that is provided. So my conclusion in summary is we support the governance statement. The recommendation from Ilac is that the board approve this, but to note that we recognise, as does the executive team, that we've got more to do going forward over the next 12 months.
Okay, Michael, if I understand it right from our conversation yesterday, there is still some wording that may need to change, and the governance statement relating to the external audit's requirement to have assurance on the first half of the year. So is there still some wording to be cleared, or has that now been resolved?
John Thunder may be in a better position than I. We left the audit committee late yesterday afternoon, and external audit wanted to just have one last look at the governance statement. They may not have done that yet, but again, I would like to get that additional assurance that they're now happy. So I would wrap that all up with the delegated authority that the board gave to me earlier. But I'm John Thunder may be able to give a bit more detail as to where we are.
Okay, John, I assume that the external audit haven't come back to us yet. The meeting only finished yesterday afternoon.
We have a list of points and questions from them which we're currently working through, but none of them seem problematic or material. So we'll make those changes. Yeah, so we'll come back just on that proposal about clearing it just at the end. In terms of Carly, just as our new Director of Governance, I know you've not been involved through the entire journey of this particular governance statement, but you've come in at the end. Any particular observations or comments that you want to add?
Just to thank Michael and Ilac, actually, because I sort of feel that we're being served up with a great opportunity here. Obviously, the content that will go into the governance statement next year will be different. We will have a different story to tell. I've had a couple of discussions with the auditors and with other colleagues about how we, from the moment this year's report is published, how we start working towards that and bring the governance statement together in a bit better way. That is, as Michael rightly highlights, dependent upon that assurance mapping work, so that we all have that greater clarity and confidence going forward. Okay, so I think brave new world. I think that's, but it's good that actually we're learning and actually we're making progress. So it certainly, from my perspective, looks better than last year. So you know, I sense an improvement, but I think there's more to go if I compare it with other organisations. So I would concur with that. Okay, can I just ask colleagues if there are any other important strategic questions as opposed to typographical errors as far as the annual report or the governance statement is concerned? Bruce.
Yes, two things. Number one, on page 16 and top of page 17, the whole business of the response to IMDS and patient involvement, I feel missing huge opportunities. I mean, we've not mentioned the setting up of the Patient Safety and Engagement Committee. There's the whole business of the patients putting their activities already into Ilac. There's a whole lot of things that could just be put in some brief text to enhance that. And the second one, briefly, on page 12, devices. The one example product is Magic, which was a rather controversial and odd one, because here was a device which was initially very promising, approved by NICE, as I've explained to the board, which long-term surveillance then suddenly showed there were problems with. And to single that out with all the other things that are done just seemed to me to be a bit odd. So those were the two things that struck me reading through.
What page was the second one on, Bruce?
Page 12.
Page 12, yeah. Okay. Rachel, I know we've actually covered things like Patient Safety Engagement Committee and the appointment of a Chief Safety Officer in other parts of the report, but I think Bruce makes a valid point when we're specifically talking about the response to the Cumberledge Review. We need to make sure we're not underselling our response there, particularly bearing in mind other work that we know we've done on that area.
Yeah, thanks very much for those comments, Bruce. We'll take those away and have a look at those two sections you've highlighted.
Okay, I think that's very helpful, Bruce. Were there any other more strategic comments on the annual report? Mandy?
I think it was just something else we mentioned to Ilac yesterday was probably to get, and with Carly's role, I think this will happen naturally, but to get the organisation to understand the importance of the annual report and maybe have more senior leadership around taking ownership of putting that together, which I assume Carly will take going forward. But I think we've made huge improvements, but I think it's still sort of collating lots of inputs. And one of the things that came up with internal audit as sort of cross-cutting themes was leadership and the culture going forward. And June's also mentioned this. And the annual report, I think, is part of that. It's that showcase in some ways of what we've done and the importance of that. And so people recognise that this isn't just a compliance issue to have. This is an opportunity to sell the agency. And so that was one of the recommendations for next year, really, coming forward, is to use the annual report not as a compliance tick the box, but as an opportunity.
Yeah, I completely agree, Mandy. I absolutely, completely agree. You know, and I think this is an opportunity, you know, to really demonstrate the value that we're adding to the, you know, the wider UK PLC, you know, to the health system generally, and ultimately to patients. So, you know, I think that sort of senior leadership, and I know that Carly will absolutely, you know, take that on board, because that's one of the reasons we created the new governance office and the director of governance, for that very reason. So I think high expectations, Carly. Sorry, but I know you can handle it. Okay, I had a couple of other sort of specific questions. Obviously, in the governance statements, we talk around the internal audits that were conducted. Can I just ask for assurance that all of the high-risk issues have been mitigated in those internal audits? So I don't know whether John or Michael can, you know, I know that's discussed regularly at ARAC, but Michael, can I just ask for assurance on that?
Yeah, I would say two things. We discussed, Stephen, there are more limited assurance this year than last year. I would emphasise that the reports where there was limited assurance, there were clear contextual issues as to why they were limited. I don't think they were systemic across the organisation, over and above the points that Mandy has made about leadership and following through. So I am confident that recommendations are being implemented, and we will follow this up in the autumn, at the autumn ARAC, to be confident that the recommendations are being fully implemented. And if you take the one major one was around the response to medical devices. We have a joint ARAC meeting with patient engagement in a few weeks. So we are being absolutely certain that we're on the case to support the agency in making sure that these risks are mitigated.
Yeah, I think this has been a real area of improvement from my perspective, where actually, you know, the internal audits, clear actions are being taken and they're being followed up by our board assurance committees. And that's a sign of good governance, frankly. So I think, again, the agency is to be congratulated on its response to those. Final question for me, if I may. Obviously, the draft annual report runs to 103 pages, which is not exactly an easy read. And Rachel, I was just wondering if you've got any plans to produce a short, easy to read, public-facing document, you know, that can maybe in sort of half a dozen pages can explain some of the key points, and then you can read the full document if you want. But what are the plans to make this more accessible for the public?
Yeah, absolutely. So we would look to produce a sort of 4 to 6 page summary that can then be shared more widely and available on the website. And then, as you say, if anybody wants to read the full detail, that's also available and linked through. But once we've got you know, the full document nailed down, we'll do the summary. Okay.
So I think you know, the two requests of the board. First, if you've got any final typographical or wording type issues, you need to let Rachel know those by the end of tomorrow by email, please. And then Michael made a proposal earlier that you know, there's a couple of pieces of maybe outstanding wording around, particularly in the governance statement relating to the external audit requests. And so Michael, I think, again asked, you know, can the board approve this document in principle? And that, yeah, and delegate the authority for Michael as the chair of the Audit and Risk Assurance Committee to clear the final wording in the governance statement before it is recommended to June as the accounting officer to sign it. So is the board content with that as an approach? I'm seeing thumbs up and nods. So, okay. So Natalie, let's you know, record that as approved in principle with that delegated authority to Michael, please. That's great. Okay. Sorry, it's taken a while just to work our way through these important governance items, but I think it is important that we, you know, that we give this you know, appropriate care and consideration. We can maybe move to a sort of a more traditional agenda topic now, and that's actually, you know, what are the current key issues from the Chief Executive's point of view? So we're on page 20 of the board pack. June, are there any sort of highlights that you'd like to bring to the board's attention, please?
Well, thank you, Stephen. And clearly, as you can see from the report, it's still extremely busy. We've just talked about how busy the last year was, But as the nation now strives to get jabs into arms of everyone over 18, you can rest assured that the agency is doing everything it can in that aim. The fourth vaccine is a great addition to the armamentarium, probably coming in around July. And of course, NIBS, as we've already said, is doing a tremendous job, 14 million doses, 15 batches in 1 month, really to provide that assurance on the purity and the strength of the vaccines going into arms. But there are other aspects that are worth bearing in mind. The agency had a role at the G7, particularly in the Health Summit on vaccine confidence. And our comms team received a warm commendation. In fact, the words were never putting a foot out of line. So the comms efforts throughout this really need to be recorded to make sure that everyone knew what we were doing and how we were doing it in a way that builds public confidence in the agency's decisions. And related to that, to develop international collaboration on clinical trials in the way that the recovery trial has put us on the map worldwide and is expanding into other countries. And I don't want to miss out in terms of access. The great job devices are doing, working in partnership with NICE and CQC and MHRA on this multi-agency advisory service, a bit linked to what Bruce might be doing this afternoon, to get the AI, the new technologies, software as a medical device out there into the health service. So in a way, it's an Ilac type model that we'll talk about soon, but delivering new technologies that really will benefit the health service. And backing up devices strategy is this registration of close to 1 million medical devices, quite phenomenal. But let's not forget that patient safety is our primary focus. It's our top priority. Rachel's already spoken about the important new step of having a patient meeting around isotretinoin, that important safety review that's looking at particularly hard to discuss in public issues that the people who've had them experienced in their families and themselves have been so informative during our public consultation. So now it's time to talk about what next, and that's on the 16th of July. A couple of other aspects related to that. Pleased to say our consultation on patient and public involvement opened on the 24th of May. We've already had close on 250 responses, and it's open right till close to the end of the month. So a chance to put in a plug if you haven't shared views yet. You know, it's wide open for all stakeholders. I wouldn't want to also miss out on the annual event, the global effort called Pangea, for the enforcement teams of the MHRA to get out there with other enforcement teams and seize millions of illegal products, protecting people from probably what's one of the worst crimes, which is a falsified or an illegal medicine. So a lot happening to make sure that we protect the public in lots of different ways. It's only possible through the staff who've worked so, I would say, relentlessly through the last year to keep these important initiatives running, and particularly at a time when we're talking about our important future. We've already spoken about the sustainability, but the transformation of the organisation, particularly the agreement of our EDAT, our Digital Data and Technology Roadmap, that will be an important footing for the new outcome focus processes that we'll be running. So lots of work going on, safety the number one and always will be, but a huge thanks to staff right across the agency. Stephen, back to you for any questions or any topics colleagues would like to explore further.
Okay, well thank you, June. Yeah, I think as always, an incredibly comprehensive report. I think it just demonstrates the sheer breadth of responsibility and activities that the agency conducts. So thank you, as you say, to all the staff and your good self, of course, as well. Mercy, do you want to kick us off with a question, please?
Well, actually, it's just more comment than question. Obviously, for the ILAP patient reference group that we're probably not going to talk about too much in the paper today, that is coming back for a review at the Patient Safety and Engagement Committee. Just in about 6 months to see how it's going. So we're hopefully getting some feedback on how that reference group is actually working. So we really kind of welcome that back. as well. Also, just wanted to highlight the multi-agency advisory service and working kind of with NICE and others, because I noticed the NICE evidence standards framework on AI development has just been published, and I just wondered what our role in that had been. And lastly, just thanking June for introducing me to This Week in Virology, which I did watch the podcast, and it was what I could understand, which wasn't a huge amount, but certainly the bit where they compare which vaccines are their favourite, which was quite interesting. So if you haven't seen that and seen these experts talking about those things, it was quite interesting. And obviously the polio stuff was really fascinating as well.
Well, if I might say, Stephen, I really welcome some of those reflections, because I think it more than demonstrates the changes we're introducing. Sam will talk more about Ilac and how we want to get not just patients engaged, but involved in designing and even looking at outcome measures for studies. That will be a real test. Is it a meaningful response, a meaningful dialogue that we're having? In terms of multi-agency advisory service and the NICE guideline, yes, this is totally collaborative, because one doesn't move without the other, and an exciting time to start filling in regulatory gaps around how you truly regulate the safety and performance in these sometimes learning systems. Really interesting. And of course, with polio, to be sharing that ambition to eradicate polio, what could be a finer thing for the NIBS colleagues to aspire to? I think I've mentioned to you before, they've got a strapline on their desks, I'm eradicating polio, or their wall. You know, it's a fine aspiration, and it's achievable, which is what makes working for this agency such an attraction for the talented people who are here.
Great. I had a couple of questions from Dr. Barbara Bannister, who sent her apologies today. Barbara is one of our non-executive directors. I'm not sure you'll be able to completely answer these, June, but the first one is about your paragraph 8 regarding remote clinical trials. And Barbara's asked, will we be using mobile smartphone technologies of a type that could be used by some of our global partners? So trying to use technology to assist global remote trials as opposed to just national ones. Is that something that you know is being considered?
The strategy that we're part of, which government initiated, in fact, as part of Building Back Better, is to take the trial to the patient or the member of the public. And for certain conditions, we're looking particularly like mental health areas and perhaps even dementia, to use wearables in a way that fits with someone's life. The key question is then, can we do this on a bigger and more international level? So G7 has agreed a charter, and we're really looking forward to working, and we're kicking off now with the International Coalition on Medicines Regulatory Authorities. That's a great umbrella, but we're particularly looking to the FDA for a transformation in this area. So I think if Barbara Bannister is especially interested, glad to follow that up, because it's for us to try and move fast. And in terms of the earlier comment about delivery, Sir Patrick Vallance, our Chief Scientific Advisor, who's overarching this, is waiting for another report, I think, towards the end of the year. So, you know, we will motor on this, but it's all about making trials part of people's lives. I'll just finish by saying, for 500,000 people who said, count me into the vaccine trials, the country has done magnificently, thanks to everyone out there who's participated, let alone the 40,000 in the recovery study. Of course, they're in hospital. But where we are now is take the trial to the person who's volunteered and make it part of their life. So form filling, etc., use wearables instead. It's a really, really big and fundamental change.
Yeah, and I think your point around the International Coalition of Medical Regulators is really important, because we're going to need common data standards for some of these things, so we can work across boundaries. And so it feels like a detail at one level, but another level, it's the key enabler that will make this genuinely multi-centre, multi-country, which I think is really what we'll need to achieve. Barbara had another observation just on the Access Consortium comments, and I read out, she said, The Access Consortium is good news for the UK's position in the global regulatory arena. Will the proposed work-sharing agreements help to mitigate some of the loss of income from our previous European work?
That is definitely the aspiration, because we believe that with the Access Consortium's market share of 150 million, that we're creating equivalent to a third pillar of international regulation, FDA, EMA, and access. We're about to publish, with good leadership, effective leadership from Canada, who has the chair at the moment, a strategy which will include innovation. It will include end-to-end, which is our whole Ilac philosophy, right from the molecule or the entity, the device, through to the bedside. And that kind of collaborative working, if we can achieve it on an international platform, will surely create an environment to help bring not just the work to the MHRA, where our expertise will be used, but the devices, the medicines to the patients and to health service. So I hope that sounds like a commitment. Work starts now. Access will publish anytime now, and then we'll follow that up with performance measures.
That's great. Okay, thank you for doing those. I think it just shows our non-executive directors are committed, because they read the papers even when they can't attend the meeting. Yeah. So, which is great. Were there any other questions from other colleagues who are online today? Barbara did ask another question, which she said only if there's time, but it's maybe a question maybe Sam could maybe help us with, and it really is, you know, can you summarise what the impact of Brexit has been on our inspection and enforcement activities? I think you've partly covered that briefly on a previous report, actually, Sam, but is there a couple of lines you could just say just to complete the loop on that?
Wow, big question with probably quite a long answer as well, to be honest. But so I think from an inspection perspective, it's been quite interesting, because obviously we've had to deal with the pandemic as well. But we continue to work towards greater levels of reliance with other regulators, and that's one key area. I mean, we were doing that before anyway, because it makes sense. But obviously now with the exit from the EU, that really does come into the fore, because we need to identify ways of using resource efficiently across the globe. I would say, you know, we have to inspect and monitor a huge number of facilities globally across the global supply chain, and it's in all of our interest to do that. So we did have a Europe to FDA relationship, of course, and agreement, and we've been setting up our own with the FDA, for example. So there's things like that are happening. There are different levels depending on which areas of inspectorate. Things have increased or decreased depending on the exit from the EU. So I won't go into huge amounts of detail about that, but I think it's just been something we've just had to adjust. And the other thing that we're working very hard on is around digital inspection. So looking at how we can do things remotely, looking at hybrid approaches, and looking at more innovative ways of inspecting. And that's again come out of both the two economical shifts of exiting the EU and the pandemic. So I think that broadly covers the inspectorate. I mean, there's an awful lot more that could be said. The enforcement's an interesting one. I mean, again, there's a lot of international work that's been ongoing, and as you'll have seen from June's report, Operation Pangaea really does demonstrate that those global networks still work and are very effective, even with our exit from the EU. I mean, the numbers really are quite astronomical. As always, this group does a tremendous job every year in terms of bringing down websites or seizing products. I think there was somewhere in the region of 3 million product units of medicines and medical devices that were seized this year. So that element of it is still really crucial to maintaining the security of the global supply chain. And so that's absolutely something we're working on very closely with. In terms of sort of more specific dealings with the EU, there has been some levels of work around data sharing and how we manage that shift from exiting the EU, but we've found ways of managing that through the course of well, the last few years. I guess we've had time to really discuss that and find the right solutions to ensure that we're not sort of blindsided by anything, and we still have those networks. So A lot of work, I would say, but actually fundamentally the objective of each group is still there. We're just doing things slightly differently.
Yeah, I think that's great. It just goes to show the international reach of the agency. Absolutely. You know, we have an absolute leadership role in terms of the international enforcement activities. There's no question of that. An increasing use of reliance with other regulators on some of our inspection work. It just makes sense for everybody, to be honest. And so, you know, I think it just shows the agency is adapting and wants to continue to be a global player as far as it comes to medical product regulation is concerned. So again, that's great context, Sam. So thank you very much. So, unless there are any other questions, could I therefore suggest that you know, we note June's report with great thanks. You know, I think it's again, as I said, a very comprehensive report, June. It speaks for itself. But thank you very much for everything that you and everyone in the team is doing. That being the case, let's move on to the next item. So, next item is around healthcare access, and it's what are the strategic priorities for the development of the innovative licensing and access pathway. So page 28 of the board pack. Sam, you can assume people have read the paper, but you know, any introductory comments you'd like to make?
Thanks very much, Chairman. So obviously we had an update earlier in the year, and this is really a further update in terms of where we've got to, and the paper just provides a little bit of background and context in terms of the Ilac programme and the fact that it was launched back at the start of the year, and obviously we now have 32 applications, I think is the latest, albeit they're still coming in, and certainly a little bit quicker than we anticipated, I think. The programme is very much one of end-to-end and focusing on three key priorities, which really want to bring to the board today, which is embedding the patient voice and really progressing with that work. So very much around the patient reference group, getting that set up, looking to see how we can use that group really effectively to impact patient outcomes. So it's sort of early days for that patient reference group, but what we're trying to do is obviously get the terms of reference set up and embedded, and then going on from there, we need to see how we can most effectively use the experience and knowledge of the individuals within that group on the steering committee, but also on other areas through the target development profile activities. So it's a work in progress in that respect, but it is fundamental in terms of the Ilac programme, and equally it's a foundation in a sense. It runs right the way through from end to end, and we're trying to identify as many opportunities as possible to get that patient voice in the decisions and the discussions that are ongoing. The second area, I guess, is ensuring we have a sustainable model. This is something which we touched on earlier in terms of the fee strategy group, which John Fundry mentioned. This is a piece of work that's again ongoing in terms of really identifying all of the different activities we're trying to learn as we go, because there's some elements in terms of the target development profile, the TDP, that we're still developing at the moment. As we develop them, we need to identify what resources needed and therefore what's an appropriate fee. But more broadly, we're working with partners of Ilac to ensure a consistency of approach in terms of fees that might be charged for activities, to ensure there's no disparity, I guess, between the partners. And so it looks like it's very much joined up, and indeed it is. And we want the external view and indeed the activity that's being undertaken by the partners to be very cohesive, because that's absolutely fundamental to the programme. So that's again ongoing. We're just wanting to make sure that we do actually reach that cost recovery and make sure we have a sustainable model going forwards. The final area is really the finalising the partnership agreements with the various different partners. Also thinking about the constitution and makeup of the steering committee, and then the more strategic view around that is how it fits with the various different elements across the healthcare life cycle or landscape, and all of the other different products that are out there and services. So we obviously have the common ways of working, CWAR with HRA, and we've talked about that at previous meetings. We've got our own early access EAMS scheme, and there's also other things, for example, like NHSE's Digitrials, as well as our own Cprd recruitment activities. So there are various different things we're trying to look at and knit together into a package that's a system-wide package. So I'm doing a lot of work at the moment in terms of really collaborating across the system just to try and start to build a picture of the different services so that we can actually have a cohesive package, which again falls into all of those other things which I talked about earlier in terms of the sustainable model, but also the embedding that patient voice and ensuring we can get that across the health landscape, not just within the small parameter of the activities we're doing. The final point to make is that you'll also see there's a comment in relation to, or a couple of paragraphs in relation to the devices, CNAP, or the critical need access pathway. This is different, I would say, from ILAP because it's looking at both critical need but also targeted innovative products, and it's very much in its infancy in terms of where we're at, and the name is still under review, and there are things that we need to tease out about that, but there's some early discussions and very productive discussions with partners like NICE to really see how we might be able to implement something similar, or maybe how we can knit the two together, ILAP and the devices element, and see what sort of model we can put forwards. But at the moment there are a few differences. We're teasing through those different differences, and also thinking about how that knits into the regulatory framework for devices, which is obviously coming down the path as well. So quite a lot of work ongoing. It's I guess this is where we are at the moment. It's certainly an update, and I'll be very happy to bring back a further updates later in the year and answer any questions now. Thank you, Chair.
That's great, Sam. I think it's a very thought-provoking piece. I think there's a number of comments we could potentially make. But just before we rush to questions, could I maybe just ask a question to maybe Alison Straff? Because obviously one of the real benefits here with ILAC is that we're actually working with other partners, and particularly with devolved administrations, and thinking of the SMC. So Alison, I know you're not involved with the SMC necessarily as a member, but have you picked up any feedback from the SMC about the role of ILAP and the potential opportunities that it presents?
Thanks, Chairman. And my division sponsor the Scottish Medicines Consortium, and I am an observer at the meetings. And I guess just to feedback, and actually having recently just spoke to the chair and the kind of chief pharmacist for the SMC, they're incredibly supportive of the work that's underway around ILAP, and I know are enjoying contributing into the process. And I think we can see benefits in terms of that kind of whole upstream discussion with companies at an early stage, which will benefit as we go through the system, getting into the health technology assessment processes that we operate across the UK. So I have warmly welcomed SMC's involvement in this, and I suppose just picking up on the theme around resourcing, I mean, I also recognise that it's going to require additional resourcing, and we've made a bid in to our finance directorate in Scottish Government to make sure that we can ensure that ongoing input from the SMC in terms of having the right resources there to also support the work that they contribute in as part of the process. So we certainly are 100% behind this, and very keen to continue to contribute through the SMC and through how we look at our systems for access more generally around new medicines. So thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute that.
No, that's great. Well, I really welcome your involvement, frankly, Alison. So that's great. I know colleagues have got a number of questions. We probably need to try and do some sort of, try and order that. But before we do that, could I just ask for another piece of feedback? So not a question, Mandy, I want to ask you a question. And that's because obviously you do consultancy work with a number of different organisations. What feedback have you picked up from your pharmaceutical clients about ILAP? So thinking about the customer's perspective.
Thanks, Stephen. I think small, medium-sized companies are quite nervous about a regulator at any place. So there's a reluctance quite often to engage. So I think making it simple is really important. And I think the ILAP process gives that opportunity. But I think there's education to do in the industry, particularly for smaller, innovative companies, to understand that the regulator is there not to say no, but is there to take the wider view around help. They can't tell you yes or no, but design of trials, which ultimately will reduce the investment that companies have to make to get a medicine to market. And I think we have to position this very holistically, particularly when we're looking at the fee structure. But scientific advice is just so important for companies as they're working through the process. So I think there's a lot of work to promote this. I think there's also simplicity. The regulatory processes for country to country are complex. So the fact that, you know, this will relate eventually to ICH and aspects like that, really important. But this takes a very logical view. If that logic can then be taken to the FDA or the EMA or other regulators, that's really important for international companies. But I think they're often quite bewildered. You go on the EMA's website, it's quite daunting looking at finding your way through. If we can help companies have a simple, logical framework, but also that benefit, and they're going to save a lot of money if they don't do trials which are poorly designed or not bringing that back. So I think we have to take a broader perspective. And I think this framework is really very powerful. And I would say if we could use that for everything as a framework, whether you're formally in or out, it will help map and companies think about their target development profiles early on. Okay. So that was my perspective.
That's great. I will let you ask a question in a moment, Mandy, but I just wanted to get that context. So I think we've heard from Alice and from the SMC experience, we've heard from a pharmaceutical perspective there. To help us work our way through this, rather than just dot around all over the place, I think what I'll do is ask for questions around patient involvement first, then questions around the sustainable model, which Sam mentioned, then questions around the partnership agreements and strategic fit with other things, and then finally some questions around devices. So Sam identified the 4 key areas, and I think it might be helpful for Sam to be able to answer them in groups in that sort of way. So can I first of all ask if there are any questions around the patient involvement component of this, and then we'll pick up anything else that I've missed after that. Mercy, did you put your hand up? Yeah, you're there.
I did, sorry. Just to kind of focus on keeping an eye on that patient reference group and how they actually are involved. I think it was quite clear from our committee viewpoint that it's really important about how powerful they are in those groups. Are their voices actually heard? So it's and acted upon. So it's actually seeing that and being transparent about that, because obviously there will be kind of differences on steering groups and within that kind of process. But we really need to know how people's points are taken into account, and perhaps kind of having other patients come in, or not just rely on the patient reference group and stuff. I think it'd be clearer for us once we know the composition of that group, and obviously how it's working out in practice. So that's my only observation on that. And yeah, I'd kind of welcome to see how this whole process might help in other parts of the agency as well.
Yeah, I'd probably quietly suggest actually that maybe we need more than one patient group that's actually going to be involved in this process, because it's a huge undertaking potentially to be involved in every single investigation. So maybe a pool of patients, for example. Sam, is there anything that you want to just come back on Mercy's point there? I'll move on to someone else.
Not really, Chairman. I mean, I think they're all very valid points and something we can certainly build in as we go forwards. And the organisation already has obviously the patient and public forum, which obviously is another opportunity to get patients involved. I think we need to look at that across the board and make sure we're just not creating more and more. We need to make sure we're targeting those groups. Yeah. But absolutely, I acknowledge and agree with those comments that Mercy's just made. Thank you.
Bruce, can I come to you?
Yeah, it's simply, I'm riding the same hobby horse as I have in previous meetings to say that the Ilac Patient Reference Group presents, as I see it, about the very best opportunity that I've seen for documenting meticulously the input and influence of patients on the system. And I hope the agency is recording all of this in the greatest detail in order to publish it along the lines I've banged on about. One other slightly tangential point in terms of the way this is presented, and this bears on what I'm going to say later about devices. I just find, you know how important and passionate I am about patient involvement, but the fact that that comes at the very top of the sort of priorities. Patients can't contribute well unless the structure, the collaborations, the whole system is well enough worked out. And so to me, the structure, the collaborations, the working out of the system, to me is the most important thing, because it's only once that has been done that we can profit from patients' experience, opinions, and so forth. So it's just that presentation bothered me slightly.
Okay, Sam, I can see you nodding to that. So I think
I totally agree, Bruce. Actually, and apologies for the presentation if it somewhat exercised you, Bruce, because it wasn't meant to. Maybe I should have said at the start they're all very important elements, and the structure and the partnerships and the arrangements with the partners, for example, is something I'm personally taking up to ensure that that's all right, along with the governance and that broader strategic piece in parallel, because we think it's equally very important to start getting the patient involvement. That's also happening, and the team is supporting me in terms of delivering that. So it's not meant to be one is more important than the other particularly, but I do agree that you need the structure in order to get the best out of any collaboration with patients. So thank you, Bruce.
Yeah, that makes sense. Michael, have you got a question on patients, or is it something else?
No, it was a question, and it is a relatively minor one. Obviously this is brilliant, really, really supportive. I think there's something, though, about the communication and how you position it. Just reading the paper, all the words in there are innovation, speed, increasing access, all very worthwhile. But I think it's important that we shouldn't forget that in the eyes of certain people in the population, speed, innovation can be associated with cutting corners. And so I think there's always a question of balance, isn't there? We're doing all this at no risk. We're not increasing the risk to patient safety. And I think the word safety needs to be built much more into the communication, in my view, because I've seen systems like this in other sectors that, for all the worthwhile reasons, flip. And the next thing you've got is the media reverse the polarity. And for all the good reasons that we intended, it becomes undermined. So it's keeping the language balanced. And it's a small point, but I think it's quite important.
Yeah, I think we'd concur with that, wouldn't we, Sam?
We would indeed, I think. And actually, when we come to talk about devices, obviously, speed isn't necessarily the key objective. So, there is a balance, and we'll consider that going forward. Thank you.
Yeah. Mandy.
Thanks, Stephen. It's really... building on the point that Bruce made, I think having that system underlying not only is the importance of the patient reference group, but it's also making sure the innovators, the drug developers, are involving patients in their trial design, because almost like getting that as a way of getting regulatory approval sort of forces us to involve patients. And I think quite often developers can be focusing on the science and whether the drug works, which it might do chemically, but also the impact it has on patient lives is something that's seen as sort of a bit more woolly. So I think having those systems that Bruce mentioned to, for real world outcomes, how we analyse patient evidence not only involves more patients because we can have more people because it's for every trial, then it's actually making a big impact. But I think it's us putting those systems in.
I think that's endorsing the same point, I think, isn't it?
Yeah. Chairman, maybe I can just comment just on that, because one of the things that we do, for example, for the Innovation Passport application is require the applicants to indicate where they're involving patients, where they're getting benefit from those involvements. and what additional benefit they could gain if they had more input from patients. So that's part of it, and that's just the first step. So every step we're requiring and expecting applicants to actually engage with patients, and that is being built in not just from what we do within the organisation, but as from the applicant perspective as well. So I think it is there. It's perhaps not come through in the paper, and apologies for that.
No, I think that's fine. I think there's lots of work to do, and that's why this process is a great framework for a much wider range of drugs, I think, building also on what Michael's saying.
Yeah. Okay. The next point that Sam talked about was around sustainability model, and I think actually in some ways we've already partly covered the fact that we're going to do fees work and identify, so I suspect actually in some ways there's maybe not too many questions on that, because that's a piece of work in progress as it strikes me. But were there any specific comments around sustainability model? No? Okay. Oh, Mandy.
Sorry, this is a very interesting paper. I think looking at the fees we're charging now, I was struggling to see how they would cover the expertise that we're doing. So I think it's really looking at this very broadly. And also taking a perspective of how expensive it is to bring a drug to market. And if you're, saving 10% off that budget by not having wastage of trials and involving patients early, it can really help developers save money. So, it's not quite like a profit sharing arrangement, but I think we've got to look at that perspective rather than just the hourly rate of a scientist and expert in the agency, because it's worth an awful lot, and getting drugs to patients more quickly is having a huge benefit for everybody. Yeah,
so I think the point you're making is the value to the pharmaceutical industry may be higher than the cost it is for us to produce it. So, but we need to think about how that fits in with a fee structure and legislative requirements of just recovering our costs as opposed to making massive surpluses. So there's a balance to be made there. But Sam, is there anything else you want to add on that?
Yeah, just to build on that, if I may. I mean, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the fees originally were based on our old current fees, if that makes sense, and so they are being looked at through the fees strategy group. But I think the other element of this, and Mandy, you sort of comment on it a bit earlier in terms of engagement of those SMEs and making sure that they don't see us as sort of a scary organisation they can't work with. It's probably worth just reflecting the importance of the Innovation Office and our sort of front door that we've got, because the Innovation Office gets in the region of, well, I don't know, I think it's somewhere in the region of 1,200 inquiries at the moment, and I would say about 1% of those come from big pharma. The rest are from academia, SMEs, so we do have a good sort of reputation, I think, and engagement through the Innovation Office. But of course, we have to sort of consider that in the whole round of how do we make this a sustainable sort of program, because the Innovation Office is part of that as well. So it's all of these different elements we do need to tease in, which will be discussed through that fee strategy work.
Yeah, don't underestimate the perception within industry that regulators are scary, and that's based on a lot of international experience from the other side of the Atlantic, perhaps, in particular, where there's a real fear of some major international regulators, genuine fear of getting something wrong. So it isn't always rational, but we need to accept that that's probably the case. Okay, another area then you mentioned, Sam, was around partnership agreements, in particular how Ilac fits with other services, because there's a number of different offerings. Is there any perspectives from board members in terms of how Ilac can fit in? Let's focus on the medicines to start with, and then we'll come to devices in a moment. I think just from my point of view, Sam, I think there's a risk of it becoming very confusing. And I think that gets in the way of companies knowing which particular pathway to go through. And so I think let's not, again, underestimate the size of the challenge that actually presents. So, David, I know your hand isn't working, but your physical one is.
Yes, sorry, yes, so the physical one is. But yeah, so Sam, so I noticed in my reading of the Ilac report that most of the collaborations that we're setting up with companies so far are relatively late stage. I think that's how you describe it. And does that mean that the opportunity to collaborate to incorporate health economic data doesn't yet exist properly? Or how is it possible at a late stage to incorporate health economic data to make use of the nice SMC collaborations?
Thanks, David. So they're not all late stage. I think some are a bit early. In fact, we've had some very early stage products, but I don't think it's out of the question to have those interactions and to have some discussions. And certainly, NICE and SMC have engaged and said that they would be keen to have discussions, and certainly we'll be sitting at some of those meetings. We have had more, actually, probably questions around having other organisations like MHRA involved in some areas, and we're sort of teasing out how that would work at the moment, because obviously not being part of Ilac currently, it's how do we ensure we still bring the right parties to the table with the right information, guidance, data, etc., that feeds into the whole product development process, dependent on where they sit in the particular pathway. So I would say it's a little bit of a work in progress, as many things are with this at the moment, David. But I think as we get more applicants through the process, then, and as they go through into the TDP stage where we're actually discussing the next step, then I think we'll get a much better understanding of what's needed. I think the other element, just to point out, is actually a lot of the applicants don't actually know what they need. And actually we're still trying to work that through with them. So to answer your question is a little bit tricky, because in some cases they don't know what they need and we're still trying to work out what might be beneficial. So yeah. probably not a completely black and white answer for a...
No, I think that's part of the collaborative and consultative approach, Sam, to be fair, that this scheme is all about. So maybe I could just bring June into the conversation here, because June, I'm interested in your perspective of where you see Ilac fitting in terms of the different medicine regulation opportunities that we can provide. I just wondered if you had a perspective around that.
There are a couple of perspectives. One in relation to the other accelerated processes we can provide, but also the landscape, which I think is part of Sam's work at the moment. Certainly, I think we can very clearly distinguish this from EAMS, which is much later in the pipeline, and meeting a need. And so you're creating a window, for example, with a drug like remdesivir, that will actually quickly get the product into healthcare. Whereas Ilac is an end-to-end and properly collaborative from day one. And I think David's comment already pinpoints an area where we need to think through again how to get that health economic data in quickly, as we saw with the recent Tagrisso osimertinib. In terms of the wider landscape, we've been part of the Accelerated Access Collaborative from day one. And what we're increasingly seeing, interestingly, is a move away from let's have a single front door, but let's have multiple front doors, but that cohesive center runway where actually we create a bespoke around a product. So it's that, I think, that the board will, I think, see as a reasonable first step to resolve confusion. One front door is probably never going to be fully the way to go. But if we have that innovation office, we're very, if you like, open, business doors open, and then get people into the right pathway bespoke for their product, taking into account all the reservations people can have, but we're beginning, as Sam's highlighting, to understand, will this affect my cost recovery? Will it preclude something else? The more we can start to, will it perhaps be a difficult pathway through to other regulators, for example, and that's why we want to see an Ilac equivalent in the access pathway. So the more we can see it from others, which is what this is such a good conversation for, the more we'll get it fitted in as a piece of a jigsaw. But bottom line is, a piece is missing, Ilac fills. And that's why I think we're seeing such good response. Now's the time to tailor make that response so that we protect our independence, we get the best expertise from whoever needs to give it and deliver for patients. So it's a piece of a jigsaw, but it most certainly fills a gap.
Yeah. I think that's helpful context, because it needs to fit into all of the other sort of services and offerings that are available. I suppose that leads on quite nicely potentially to the role of devices. And there's a proposal in here around the the CNAP pathway, looking at clinical needs. Well, Bruce has got his hand up, so why don't we go straight to a question there, Bruce?
Well, it's less of a question. I just perhaps like just to speak for a minute or two about this, because on whichever page it is, 3.6, there's a proposal for a new and completely different pathway for medical devices. And I'd just like to challenge this, because it seems to me that the general description of the Ilac process on pages 2 to 3 is in principle applicable to devices. I mean, the fact the types of studies and some other aspects would need to be different is neither here nor there. The fact also that we're currently in a position of completely redesigning the regulation of medical devices and their approval means that the agency could potentially take into account its offer of ILAP in terms of the way regulations are structured. I mean, this is a unique opportunity. And that would be in tune with the very clear ambition of the agency to abolish the separation between medicines and devices as far as possible, and to deal with them as cohesively as is feasible. Now, to my mind, the idea of simply having a critical need pathway for devices goes off at a tangent. It's different, and it misses the much more generalizable opportunity of an ILAP type process for devices. And to me, that seems to be missing a trick if our aim is to attract developers and companies to the UK. Because any streamlined process like ILAP about devices shouldn't necessarily be about clinical need, but simply making the UK system attractive for companies who want to get their devices into healthcare quickly. And it could indeed steal a march on the EU and perhaps the USA if it's done well. The fact the costs have been kept so low, and that they may need to be different for different kinds of companies, but the fact they're low makes an ILAP type process very attractive for the many small developers and companies in the field of medical devices and technologies. I'd add, and I think this has been referred to already, that introducing multiple new pathways, I think, is confusing to everybody. And in this context, one's looking at the possible confusion between ILAP, EAMS, CNAP, other pathways of both the agency and of NICE. And finally, and probably unpopularly, I'm going to suggest that I think ILAP's a pretty lame acronym. It's not a catchy acronym. I mean, I think the agency should be able to do better than that. ILAP wouldn't necessarily accommodate devices well because they're not licensed. And I just wonder whether the sort of communications might of the agency should consider something catchier. And if they're going to do that, they should do it soon. And I'll stop there before anyone starts throwing things at me.
No, we're not going to throw things at you, Bruce. I will let Sam respond in a second, but Mandy, I saw you nodding curiously during parts of that. So do you want to
I wholeheartedly agree with Bruce on that. I think ILAP forms a great framework, and if we can use the same framework for all medicines and devices, and you'll use some bits more than others, that would just make so much sense. And it then enables people to understand what regulation and risk benefit on safety and efficacy is really about. So I wholeheartedly agree with Bruce.
And without adding any fuel on the fire, Sam, I'm afraid I completely agree with my colleagues as well, because I don't think it makes sense to go off on a tangent, as Bruce calls it, with the critical needs assessment. The principles around ILAP, I think genuinely, from my point of view, are also completely in line for medicines or medical devices. So we need a medical product pathway is the way I would think about it. There's got to be some nuances around, the specifics around devices and medicines clearly, but the principles should be the same. And also, just from a branding point of view, again, I think we need to move away from the whole concept of licensing, because actually, as part of the brand name, because it doesn't promote the primary outcome of this, which is quicker patient access to new medical products. And so if I was giving a brief to the communications agency to actually come up with the branding for this, I would focus on what is the outcome that this service provides, not what the input is, which is we're going to have a pathway and a process and we're going to do this regulatory bit and this regulatory bit. Yeah, I don't think that helps people to understand how this is used. So I think we've got a branding opportunity, and at a time that we're looking at the branding of the agency anyway, it strikes me that this would be another product brand that we could be thinking of more broadly. So again, that would be my 2 pence worth, but I feel quite strongly about that too. So Sam, I'll give you time just to reflect quickly on on that. Any initial responses to say that we're wrong?
I wouldn't call you wrong at all. No, no. So seriously, the ILAP acronym. I mean, I've personally always struggled with it a little bit. I do agree that having CNAP and ILAP, I mean, we could end up using the whole alphabet in all our different acronyms. It gets quite silly. I think what this is a symptom of is the fact that we have the medical devices regulatory framework being built at the moment. They're still in the sort of old world, and getting things to market quickly isn't necessarily the objective, because actually in the old world, things get to market perhaps a little bit too quickly. So with the new regulatory framework going forwards, yes, there is an opportunity, I think, to build something like this in, where actually we're really focused on the innovative products. I mean, there's 880,000 products registered at the moment for devices. So we need to target this for devices, I think, going forwards, otherwise it would be very difficult to manage. And there's also the element of how do we work through the approved body relationship, which obviously needs to flow if we're going to take a bigger role in terms of getting things into the market. So I think it's a bit of a phasing and a timing issue that's created what we've got here. And in terms of having something aligned, I agree. June and I have had similar discussions, and I think, June, you talked about innovative development pathways or something like that. So it was more around something that was sort of comprehensive for the 2 different types of medicines and products. So I think we can certainly take it away and have a look at it. That's partly why it says CNAP names under review, because I personally don't think it's appropriate. But certainly I'm happy to take this away and have further discussions with EXCO and colleagues who are working on ILAP and CNAP and see what we can do.
Okay, I think your paper has triggered a lot of good discussion. I was wondering whether, June, I can give you the last word on this in terms of what you would like to see as the next steps as the Chief Executive.
Well, really welcome this. It's at the right time to truly influence. What we've found, as mentioned before, that there's a real gap here that shows how the agency's expertise and scientific assets can be used to enable. I think a common approach is really welcome. I think that's been a tremendously helpful reflection there that we will immediately act on. It's given us everything we need, top down as well as bottom up, to deliver this. It shouldn't matter whether a patient needs a medical device or a medicine. If it's the right one for them, if we can get it there as safely as possible in the shortest time, that's exactly what the agency is here to do. And to think about our different stakeholders, we've seen academia, we've seen small and medium enterprises, wherever that brilliant idea or proposal comes from. So let's take it away. We'll rethink. We'll come back with a reborn enabled pathway, because I think, as Mandy so rightly said, that's how everything should be. Because if something's worth doing by everyone, whether it's us or NICE or the NHS, if it's patients who need it, let's do it as well as we possibly can and do it in collaboration. So our collaboration and our enabling pathway will come back as one to meet the needs of patients and healthcare. And just give us a month or so, but it will be reborn. Thank you.
You see, I think that's helpful. We also need to understand the collaboration point. It's not just completely down to us, because we have partners involved in this process as well. And so as it happens, June, we're meeting the Chair and Chief Executive of NICE next week. I think this could be on the agenda as a way of starting to progress that, and clearly we need, with Alison's help as well, we need to be thinking about the SMC, contribution to this. So, that's why I'm so pleased Alison was able to hear this conversation today. So I think on page 36, the board is asked to endorse the proposals and recommend any other areas for development. I think from the way the discussion's gone, I think we can probably endorse the direction, but not necessarily the specific proposals, because I think there's been quite a number of areas of development identified. But actually, we're absolutely on the right path here. And I think we've taken on board some of the comments that have been made by the board today. I think we'll get an even stronger offering. And as long as we can also get the support of our stakeholders and our partners, then I think we've got a genuinely a world-class offering we can have here as well. So let's aim for that. We'll talk offline, June, about the timing to come back to this, but probably not until after the summer, to be fair. So thank you, Sam. Appreciate your time. Okay, the last item on our agenda this morning is a short assurance report from the Patient Safety and Engagement Committee. So page 37 of the pack. Mercy, you can assume that we've read it, but what is the most important thing for the board to know from your report?
I just want to highlight 3 things, really. One is that we did have a discussion on transparency in the workings of our committee. And obviously we approved at the last board that it's these assurance reports, which is, I try to give as complete a summary as possible from our committees, but also the fact that timeliness wise, it's usually comes out much more quickly than the minutes, I mean months in advance of the minutes. So for those reasons, we were going to use these assurance reports, and we are going to use them as the public document really available for everybody. Doesn't mean that that conversation has closed down. So we are going to return to it as a committee to keep reviewing what documents and the workings of the committee need to be in the public domain. So just to highlight that. We also had a look at the Cambridge deliverables, and there will be a report that comes to the board next month. I think it's important that we looked quite critically at what information we were given. We really wanted to know what difference are these changes making. So we needed to know, we needed to see more data and evidence, especially around impact and outcomes. And we were reassured that there's some evidence there that the committee will be seeing that will come back to the board and stuff. We needed to see more. So there was a very good debate on that. And lastly, I think, and this is, I think, one of the most important, is how we go forward as a committee in really shaping out how the committee operates in fulfilling our remit. So I think the work programme is trying to shape what that's going to be. So we had an initial meeting on it. I obviously am going to be talking with the governance team as well. And I've highlighted really the kind of things we would like to see within the work programme. And it is that systematic kind of view across the agency at different points, making sure we go into enough detail and really work with Ilac as well on risk, you know, what the priorities are in high risk areas as well, so that we can really coordinate that. And we have got a meeting coming up with the Audit and Risk Committee quite soon, which is a really good way to kind of bottom out some of these things and make sure it's incorporated into our work programme. So that's all I need to do in introduction. David was there. Bruce had given his apologies, so I don't know if David wants to comment more.
David, has Mercy missed anything, or is that a good summary?
It's a great summary. I don't have anything to add.
Okay, just a couple of points just from me, Mercy, if that's okay. Just on the transparency discussion, please just remember we've made a board decision that we wouldn't put names of staff into the public domain, so that if you were to want to revisit going back to putting the minutes into the public domain, they would have to be redacted. And I'm not sure that always looks good, because then it creates a suspicion of what are we hiding. But it could be just simple as the names of the people within the agency. So that would be something that would need to be squared. And I think also the timeliness of the papers is also important. So personally, I think the Board Assurance Report is a very credible, timely way of providing information in the public domain, but happy to revisit that if required. Also delighted that the Patient Safety Engagement Committee and the Audit Risk Assurance Committee are meeting together, and I think that's really important on a couple of the actions that the board has identified. But I think going forward, it's going to be really important that we make sure there's no overlap and duplication of work. So I think we need to be really clear. You know, I don't mind which committee takes up some of the particular issues, but please make sure that we don't have two committees both discussing the same issue at different times and potentially reaching different conclusions. That would not be helpful and it wouldn't be good governance. But I trust you and Michael will be able to resolve that between you quite clearly. So, okay. Were there any other particular comments anyone wanted to make on Mercy's report? June.
I'd just like to say a huge thank you, because those meetings are now starting to get real traction on how we evidence outcomes, and you know, paying tribute to Mercy for the very careful but well-judged handling. This is not me saying nice words to cover up. This is difficult. This is challenging. We have a big job to do to move from processes to outcomes, and never is it more important than with the Cumberledge report. So the committee's already starting to get traction. We've just got to see this through in conjunction with our governance team, so that this committee has in front of it all the evidence it needs to know whether we're delivering. And that will be a tremendous service to patients. So thank you.
Yeah, that's great. And Carly, I know that you know, you'll be working with the governance team to provide more support, more systematic support and coordination of agendas. Is there anything else that you want to just add in terms of, you know, the future direction and work programme?
I think once Mercy and I have met later this week and had a further chance to discuss where we will be looking to get to across all of the board assurance committees, is that clear forward look of work, the clear scheduling and profile over the year, and we will get to the point where we can kind of trace a clear pathway for our issues that, as June says, need to focus on outcomes and the impact that we're making. So we'll have a kind of cradle to grave approach right through our structures.
Great. Okay. Well, I think bearing in mind that a year ago this committee didn't even exist, I think we're making good progress. So thank you, Mercy. I'm not seeing any other questions, so I think we can note your report, you know, with assurance. Thank you very much for that. So I think that brings us to the close of the formal items on the agenda. Now we've got the opportunity to, you know, take questions from members of the public who've been observing the meeting today. Some of which who've actually submitted questions in advance, some of which have submitted questions on the day. So, Rachel, would you like to be our question host, please? And then yeah, collate the questions into groups if you can, and ask the first question.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. And there's a number of questions, bit of a mix today of questions submitted in advance and some from people who have posed them during the meeting. So I think we'll start on a question that relates to quinolones, where the questioner has said that they keep hearing at board meetings that patient safety is paramount and that listening to the patient voice is vital. How do they go about getting the voice of innocent people suffering from iatrogenic harm heard by us, the agency? And the questioner is saying they submitted written stories over 2 years ago and have been told they might be looked at in November. Last time I asked this type of question, I was told we should kick the tires, but what practical good does this actually do?
Well, that's a very good question. June, do you want to pick that one up?
Well, yes, and first of all, I'll say a big thank you. I think earlier in the meeting mentioned the fact that we're now consulting on how we should involve patients. And if I used words like kick the tires, I really meant give it a good contribution, because we're listening and we want to change. So if that was a comment that I made perhaps out of context today, then I think the message is clear. Please get involved and tell us, and that will do practical good. It will make real changes. That is the intent. In terms of the issues around the quinolone antibiotics, all reports from patients have been looked at, particularly during a very thorough scientific review that was undertaken right across the EU, with a lot of aspects to do with how we scientifically understand this issue. and weigh it against undoubted benefit, particularly that the main areas for change would be around clinician behaviour. And so we've been undertaking a series of activities really to get those warnings and the way to use these antibiotics appropriately out to patients and healthcare professionals, so that no one is in any doubt about the seriousness of this rare side effect. No one should be in any doubt at all. What we're looking forward to in November this year is one of the studies. The key question is, has this worked? It's a bit like we were just saying about the Patient Safety and Engagement Committee. Have our efforts worked? Have they produced an outcome? So the results of the main study are coming through in November, but they need to be looked at against in the context of advice from patients who write in, who tell us that perhaps their family member or loved one had this antibiotic when another one might have worked. So there's an ongoing job to do. I welcome the sentiment that's expressed here, which is you're asking for people to trust us. And my answer is, please respond and tell us how you want to see things change, because practical good will come of it. Thank you, Stephen.
Okay, thank you, June. Rachel.
Okay, we've then got a couple of questions that came about as a result of the Ilac paper that was discussed earlier in the meeting. So the first one of those relates to the patient reference group, and the questioner is saying that it's not just the patient reference group that should be involved in investigations, but a particular area might require representatives from outside, perhaps from a charity or other sources. And they add that, for example, those who have neurodegenerative or terminal diseases are willing to take more risks than perhaps they're given credit for when it comes to safety. And how will you factor that in?
Okay, Sam, is there any sort of initial response you could provide on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, thank you for the question and really important points. I think firstly, while we talk about patients, I think the patient groups as well and other charities are equally vital to the conversation, and engagement with those will be key. And you know, it is work in progress. I think we already have quite a lot of engagement with patient groups, but it's about identifying the right ones given the discussions that will happen. And we just need to get that right. And like I say, that's a work in progress, but absolutely take on board that that's needed. In terms of the second part of the question, I wish I could remember the example, but I know we've had several different discussions at an assessment level where we've been looking at particular products and brought in patient representatives to discuss their particular concerns with a particular product, and we've actually altered or had a particular perspective on that based on those discussions, and the outcome was slightly different, and that was all around the risk that the patient was prepared to take, and that influenced some level of the decisions and discussions around products. So I think it's absolutely possible for that to happen, and we just need to make sure we put up the right controls in place to ensure that it's valuable but constructive and safe discussions for everyone involved, and that the right decision is made on that risk-benefit analysis. But absolutely acknowledge that there are different risk benefits elements to consider with this, and that different patient groups will have different perspectives.
Yeah, I think the term there, Sam, is probably risk appetite, isn't it? And I think certainly, you know, some patients and some healthcare clinicians will have a different level of appetite of risk than others. It'll have to be personalised to an individual at every time. But I think it's a valid point there, and shows the real benefit of genuine, systematic patient involvement. Something I know that Bruce has talked about many times before. So, okay, I think that's a helpful input. Rachel, another question, please.
Yeah, and the other question that came up during the Ilac discussion was that if some new drugs become available or researched somewhere and they help with long-term side effects from COVID, how will the MHRA speed up the process for use on patients?
Okay, Sam, is there a response to that, please?
It's a little bit of a challenging one, this one, in some respects, because it depends on the engagement we have as much as anything else with that particular company. But certainly if we had any information that we could engage with them, we'd proactively go out and see whether they were interested in the Innovation Office or the Ilac process, for example. But I think without the detail, it's quite difficult to say what we'd actually do, if that makes sense. But there are other routes as well that we have in our armoury, as it were, that could be used for specific patients, as an example. So I think it depends on the circumstances, but we would certainly look to do that proactive engagement.
Yeah, there is an important reality that's probably also just worth referencing here, is that as an agency we are dependent on commercial companies making a submission to the MHRA submit data to the UK, then clearly we cannot approve something more quickly if we aren't given the data to do so. And I know that maybe sound obvious, but I think it's important that we have a transparent discussion around the fact that we are dependent on the developers submitting their information for approval by the UK regulator. Christian, is there another perspective you could add on this?
Thanks. Just to say that indeed this is a very important question. And I think that should, if it's not happening already, it should trigger also an internal or maybe also external scientific discussion on the various endpoints and clinical readouts that we would actually like to see and accept, because it's such a chameleon, you could say. There's so many different symptoms. So how can we get the best evidence that supports that a medicine is actually efficacious in the treatment of long COVID? And I think that this is something which we may have to develop sooner rather than later, so that we know what to study and what to look for, because that can indeed accelerate the approval, I would say, if we already know now what target development profile we would actually like to see for such medicines. Thanks.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Rachel.
Thank you. So I suggest we move on to isotretinoin, which was mentioned earlier in June's report. So there are 3 different questions on isotretinoin that have come in. So the first one relates, in fact, the first 2 relate to the expert working group review of this product that was mentioned earlier. And the first questioner says, I was given the impression by someone very high up in the MHRA that I shouldn't expect very much to change when all the evidence from the isotretinoin call for evidence has been considered. So does this mean that the whole exercise was a waste of time and that nothing in the evidence is going to bring about the withdrawal of the license for the use of isotretinoin?
June, do you want to pick that one up, please?
Absolutely not a waste of time. I hope you know, the open call for evidence and now the patient meeting on the 16th of July is proof that we have an open mind. We're leaving no stone unturned at all to look at all the new patient information that we now have. So if any impression was given otherwise, that was incorrect. We have totally open minds. We've recently, given that Professor Munir Mohamed's been moved up to chair the CHM, appointed a new chair for this expert group. And all I can say is we're going to a new level of engagement, and we're doing that because we have open minds. Quantifying is one thing, but qualifying, understanding how a risk has affected someone's life is vitally important. And we're learning from the really helpful responses we've had. We're taking it one step further at the patient meeting on the 16th of July. So I hope that reassures on the open nature to first understand the level of risk, the nature of the risk, and then to think in a risk proportionate way how that should best be managed. If there's a separate conversation we need to have, most certainly, and I'll talk with Rachel offline in terms of if any communication needs to be given on our webpage, but this is open, as it should and must be.
That's great. Okay, I think it's very clear, June. Thank you. Rachel, was a follow-up question?
Yes, there was another question. In fact, there are a couple of other questions, and I'll group them together because they're quite related. So this again relates to the review. So the questioner is asking whether all of the isotretinoin yellow card reports have been considered by the expert working group as part of the review. They are also asking whether the way the isotretinoin was authorised 40 years ago could be reviewed. And lastly, whether isotretinoin automatically got authorisation by UK regulators based on decisions made in other countries. So sort of a mix of questions, one about reviews of the isotretinoin yellow card reports and the others around the original licensing of isotretinoin 40 years ago and how that happened.
Okay, June, could I ask you to comment?
These are two good and helpful questions, and particularly as the expert group will publish a report in due course of time, the proof of what I'm about to say will be there to see. Yellow cards as a source of data are our cornerstone because it's our, if you like, hotline in, and how we usually work is that our internal teams of clinicians and scientists look at all the data, and then our expert group will see a summary. Of course, in this context, we're supplementing it by patients' open call for evidence. So in the broadest sense, the expert group has access to all of that information and can obviously ask for more. Of course, there are other kinds of data that help us after a large usage of a medicine. There may be, for example, a registry, or there might be other data sources, published literature, that we can tap into. So the expert group will have all of that. And I would expect it to be clear when the group ultimately delivers its views and recommendations that that evidence source will be well described. The second part, to move on to that, is the way the product was authorised all those years ago. Clearly, the whole spectrum of risk was not as well understood as it is now in the early stages. The advance in the treatment of acne was at that time an important one. And clearly, being a teratogen, a medicine that might cause harm to a developing baby, that was very much at the forefront, together with other skin-related reactions. It's clear that over the accrual of experience with time, other areas such as mental health and sexual function have become a bit clearer. Again, I'm sure that when the report is put together, those steps along the pathway of building knowledge will be clear in that. It's a very broad brush answer today. I hope it helps in the short term, but as I say, in the longer time, I will expect the full history to be clearly elucidated. Stephen.
Okay, thank you. Rachel.
Yes, thank you, June. And we'll move on to another product, which is a drug called luspatercept, and it's designed to try and get blood cancer patients who are dependent on transfusions off of transfusion. And the questioner is saying that this product was approved in the US a few years ago. It was approved by the EU about 6 months ago. But the questioner is saying that in the UK, the current owner of the drug and also the previous owner have cancelled approval meetings with NICE. So patients have no idea when this drug will be available, and they're saying it's the only product that's become available in 10 years. They're asking whether anything can be done to put pressure on the company to seek approval from NICE or offer a compassionate use programme in the UK.
Okay, June, could I ask you to comment on that, please?
This is really interesting, given one or two comments you've made earlier, Stephen, but what we're hearing today is a patient voice, myelodysplastic syndrome being such a, important area for people's wishing to have treatments as soon as they can if they're effective. And I think what you've highlighted here is one of the areas where, as Stephen mentioned, usually we're on the receiving end of an application. Clearly, this isn't the case. We need to understand the EU aspects here and to take this one away to consider further with the company what opportunities there might be. I think in this area, as in many patient areas, we can't keep waiting. So you've clocked 6 months have gone by. Stephen, let's take an action point to look into what, if any, hold-ups there might be. We do work, and I will say this in a positive way, very closely with other bodies, including NHS Blood and Transplant, areas where those voices need to be heard. But we've heard you today. Let's see if we can find out exactly if there are any blocks that we can do something about. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Obviously, this question was asked by someone in advance, so we've actually got their contact details. And so therefore, Natalie, if we could just take an action to respond to the person who raised the question on this aspect, that would be very helpful. So, and then we'll monitor progress at the next meeting. Okay, Rachel, back to you.
Okay, we're going to move on to the yellow card scheme and particularly COVID vaccinations in pregnancy. So the questioner is asking for an update on yellow card reports for those who are pregnant and have been vaccinated. They say they're getting some feedback from people who are nervous to have their vaccination, given that there's a lack of clinical data in the population. And the questioner is asking whether there is any follow-up data yet on babies born to trial participants last year, or whether there'll be any real-world data published for the UK anytime soon.
Okay, June, could I ask you to provide some feedback?
Really important area, and it was particularly when we knew that wider populations, including women who are expecting a baby, would want to be available for vaccination, that we asked our vaccine monitor to particularly capture any data, particularly working with Public Health England. Our vaccine monitor was set up. It's got about 250,000 odd people signed up to it now, to be able to do a bit more proactive surveillance in areas where we really knew we were lacking evidence. What I can say today is that the reports we've got so far indicate that the safety profile is the same in pregnant women as in the non-pregnant. No evidence of any particularly any adverse pregnancy outcomes that we look for, an early birth or a loss. So we haven't got any signals like that at all. But I think having had this question today reinforces the need to check back in. We're liaising internationally too with the US and other regulators, that we need to really accelerate filling in that knowledge gap that we've got. And I think the US has been doing a fair amount too. We've got a consortium of information providers. Actually, I think it's meeting tomorrow, where other bodies such as the BNF and NICE, we get together and we look at information gaps, how to fill them. And I'm pretty certain this is on the agenda. So Rachel, again, let's make sure our weekly update that we publish on a Thursday has a section on what we know so far. Thank you for the question.
Okay, that's great. Okay, Rachel.
Yeah, thank you, June. And then we have one final question, which asks whether the lack of communication between all relevant bodies, including hospital trusts, when patients are seriously harmed or lives are lost, been recognised, and how might that be addressed? So that I think this question is about cross-system working.
Cross-system working, okay. June, is there some perspective you could provide?
This is really, really exceptionally important. And in a way, the Cumberledge Review, the Independent Review of Medicines and Medical Devices, while it has a lot of recommendations that need addressing one by one, there should be an overarching approach on this. And I'm fully content that the DHSC we're working closely with are aware that the solutions to harms, where we pick them up and look at what is a regulatory response, need to be managed in this broader context. So the question, Rachel, was about people who've been seriously harmed and lives have been lost. I guess these are areas where particularly confidential inquiries come into play too. But it is a system issue, and it's one that is on the table. The ministers will be responding to the Cumberledge annual be the first year's response to the Cumberledge on progress. And it's really important that the system response is part of that rather than the individual organisations' responses. I think what I would say is that just as we've talked in innovation around the importance of collaboration, it's doubly important when it comes to preventing harms. And all I can say is we're on this one, but it means wide commitments. If you want to look at our NICE plan, and maybe something to talk about when we meet the chair and CEO of NICE, Stephen, it's up to all of us who can manage and minimise harm to do it together, and at the same time, really good place to be thoughtful, because it makes us very thoughtful indeed.
Yeah, I'll bring Catherine in, if I may, in a moment, but I think just certainly from my point of view, a system response is important. It's really important to say that the MHRA wants to be part of the solution. We want to play our part in this, but we will need other parts of the health system to also contribute to addressing these cross-system issues. I know it's really important, Catherine, in the Department of Health, that you're looking at actually how we get the fragmented health system to be more joined up and work more closely together. Is there anything else that you could add in terms of some of the initiatives that are ongoing to achieve that?
It's always something we are trying to get to be done better. In terms of June, I won't try and cover the ground June's already covered about learning on safety monitoring harms, but we are doing some work across the regulators about how we can get better alignment and join up and communicate better how the regulatory landscape works for health, and that's something that MHRA are very closely involved in. Yeah, no, I think we've got good contacts with other regulators in the system. I think I'm thinking of CQC, for example, that starts to cross over as another regulator in the space, as well as the other ones that are involved with product regulation. So I think it's a complex issue. We're playing our part, and the Department of Health is absolutely leading on this in terms of trying to join the system up better than it's ever been joined up before. And I think that's probably how I would sum it up. So, Rachel, am I correct in saying that was the last question, or was there anything else?
Yeah, that was the last question. There is a comment that was made that colleagues may also be interested in and might want to respond to. It's about a product for Alzheimer's called aducanumab, which got quite a lot of press coverage, I think, last week when it was authorised for use in the States. And the person who's put forward the comment has said that given the nature of Alzheimer's and the huge cost to the NHS and society, it will be interesting to see how consideration by the MHRA progresses, because there's likely to be a huge disparity between the views of people affected by dementia, the Alzheimer's Society, and some of the negative comments made in the press at the weekend by clinicians. So the person who's made that comment is just saying this will be a great test of the MHRA strategy to involve the public and patients. So I just wanted to share that as well, Stephen.
Yes, it's not really a question, but June, do you want to make any sort of comment on that?
It's interesting. Just a week ago, we were meeting with a particular company that's investing hugely in this area and is very keen that we don't lose sight, with all the focus on the pandemic, that there are other pandemics, and dementia is one of them. Under David Cameron's premiership, there was a real step up in interest. Of course, the question then is, what can we do now, and what would the regulator contribute? And the answer is something a bit like I think Christian commented on earlier, which is, how are trials done? And can we look again at what the endpoints are that are meaningful to patients? So we've got some work to do internally on this. And again, if the Alzheimer's Society can give us that opportunity, I think now is the time to start thinking, how could trials be done? Can we pull through some new entities that would actually see this real challenge, but addressed in a meaningful way? Aducanumab, yes, very interesting, but I think that's just a signal. Don't forget that we need to move on areas like dementia, and dementia has particular challenges, and the regulator can help address those.
Yeah, I think certainly the ageing society that we've got, it's clearly a massive, massive risk. And, you know, having been in the pharmaceutical industry myself, I know about, unfortunately, too much around the failed trials of previous compounds and getting the right endpoints in trials. I think there's a real case here for innovative clinical trial design. Could be part of the solution here. We're going to need to be quite creative and maybe support industry to try and identify the best ways to measure this, to get an outcome that will be beneficial to patients and the population at large. It's definitely an issue. But okay, thank you for the comment. Okay, Rachel, thank you. That brings a close to the public questions and answers. I'd just like to thank everybody for their asking the questions today, those of you who submitted in advance, also those who've asked the questions during the meeting today. And we'd very much like to continue the dialogue. I think that's what I'd like to say. And we'll do that in 5 weeks' time on Tuesday, the 20th of July at 10 o'clock, when we'll be holding our next board meeting. So in the meantime, the MHRA will continue to focus on enabling innovation, accelerating access, strengthening patient safety, and putting patients first in everything that we do. So on that note, I'd just like to close the meeting, thank everybody for their attendance, wish you a good day, and see you next time. Bye-bye for now.